A shout tore through the still water, sharp as a cold blade. The woman screamed that he was trespassing on community property, then raised her phone and called the police right in front of the kayak's bow. Morning at Silverpine Bay had been gentle, like a long, unbroken breath. Thin mist drifted low across the surface. Ancient pine trees stood in silence like old temple guardians. Daniel Brooks paddled his kayak slowly, strokes steady, eyes fixed ahead. He had come here to escape the noise, to live lighter after years of being drained dry. No one knew that in just a few minutes, that calm would be ripped apart. The woman stood on the wooden dock with her arms crossed, stiff, curled blonde hair, eyes sharp and cold. Margaret Linton, president of the Silverpine Bay HOA, did not hesitate for a second. There was a familiarity of authority in her voice, the kind of authority that had made many people bow their heads before. She called him an outsider, a threat to order, a threat to property values. Her words came fast and forceful, as if volume alone could bend the truth. Daniel did not respond. He stopped paddling and let the kayak drift. There was no challenge in his eyes, only surprise mixed with exhaustion. He knew people like her. He had faced far more powerful figures in cold glass offices, where every sentence could be worth millions. But here, he let silence speak for him. The police arrived faster than Margaret expected. A middle-aged officer with a calm demeanor listened to both sides. Daniel handed over his paperwork, slowly and carefully. The officer's eyes moved across the lines, then stopped, his expression shifting. He said this was private property. There was no trespassing at all. If anyone stayed, the violator would be the one who made the call. Margaret froze for a single breath. Her lips tightened, her hands clenched. She was used to being believed, to being defended. No one had ever said no to her so calmly. When the officer left, she leaned toward Daniel, her voice low and icy. This was not over. She would make sure he was gone. Daniel paddled back to shore. Old memories stirred in his mind. Seattle, nights of endless work until his body gave out. A marriage that collapsed because no one had the strength left to listen. He had sold his apartment, cut the final ties, and come here carrying the hope of living slowly and honestly. He had not been looking for conflict, but conflict had found him. Inside the small wooden house, Daniel sat down and looked out at the bay through the window. Outside, Margaret was talking to a few residents, their faces filled with curiosity and caution. Rumors spread fast in places like this. A strange man who did not attend HOA meetings, who did not bow to a Karen. To them, he was a question mark. No one knew that Daniel Brooks was not just a man who bought a house to rest. No one knew he had once read contracts, the way generals read battle maps, spotting the deepest hidden clauses. They underestimated him because he was quiet, because he stepped aside. They did not understand that his silence was a choice, not weakness. Across the bay, Margaret Linton watched the wooden house with calculating eyes. She had controlled this place for years. HOA, the way she ran it, was the law. Karen's stories begin like this, with people who believe their power is absolute. She would not accept an outsider breaking the order she had built. Daniel stood up and closed the window. He took a deep breath, smelling pine wood and salt water. A familiar feeling rose inside him, not fear, but clarity before a chessboard. He did not yet know this confrontation would pull him into the center of an HOA Karen story, exposing secrets the entire community had buried. But he knew one thing. He was not leaving, and when the tide rose, the truth would surface. 3 white envelopes were nailed straight into the wooden door before the sky had fully lightened. The hammer strikes rang out, dry and final, like a declaration of war that did not bother to hide itself. Daniel Brooks opened the door to the smell of damp morning air mixed with fresh paper. He stood still for a few seconds, staring at the bright red stamps and the cold, bold letters. Notice of violation. Notice of fines. Notice demanding payment. Each page felt like a cut. No blood drawn, yet burning all the same. The HOA had made its move, faster than he expected. crueler than Margaret Linton's polite exterior suggested. Inside the small kitchen, Daniel spread the envelopes across the table. The omniscient voice moves through the dry, rigid words, heavy with threat. Violation of shoreline use regulations. Disturbing community order. Failure to comply with quiet hours. The total fine was written out in long, exhausting wording, deliberately overwhelming the reader. This was the familiar language of HOA stories, where power is wrapped in legal formality. Daniel gave a faint smile, thin and brief. Not from fear, not from arrogance, but from recognition. He knew the rhythm. He had seen these tactics before, in meetings where the weaker side was crushed by paperwork, procedures, and exhaustion. Karen stories always begin this way. No screaming required. Just wear the other person down. Out by the bay, a black pickup truck pulled to a stop. Two men in security uniforms stepped out and drove metal signs into the ground. Community property. No unauthorized access. They worked quickly and never looked toward the wooden house, as if it no longer belonged to anyone. From a distance, a few residents watched from their balconies. Some faces showed curiosity. Some showed satisfaction. Others sighed, as if they had already predicted the fate of anyone who dared to go against the HOA. In their minds, Daniel was just a lone man. No family, no connections, easy to crush. They did not know that being alone is sometimes an advantage. By noon, emails flooded the inbox. Margaret Linton's voice appeared everywhere, cool and carefully crafted. She never mentioned Daniel by name, referring to him only as a disruptive individual, a potential threat to community value. Every sentence was chosen with precision, enough to plant fear without making direct accusations. A seasoned Karen always knows how to let others do the dirty work for her. Daniel read each line slowly. Inside his chest, an old feeling surfaced. Not anger, but focus. He remembered long nights staring at screens, when one small mistake could bring an entire project down. Back then, he learned not to react immediately. He learned to observe. That afternoon, a figure appeared on the porch. An elderly neighbor, gray hair, a paper bag in her hands. She would not look directly at Daniel as she spoke, her voice small and trembling. She warned him to be careful. She had seen this before, not for the first time. The man before him had sold his house in silence. The one after had left in the middle of the night. HOA Karen stories do not need blood to win. They only need isolation. Daniel thanked her and accepted the bag of baked goods as a rare gesture of kindness. After she left, he stood for a long time watching the narrow path leading to the main road. That road had once been advertised as a shared access way, but beneath the gravel, he began to see different lines. Questions started to form, sharp and dangerous. Across the bay, Margaret Linton sat in her spacious living room with her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low and steady, nothing like the shouting woman from that morning. She said everything was going according to plan. That pressure would make the outsider understand his place. In her eyes, Daniel was not an opponent, just a small variable to be removed. But if she had looked more closely, she would have seen something else. Inside the wooden house, Daniel Brooks was opening his laptop. Not to complain, not to ask for help, but to dig deeper. He began pulling up old records, maps, details. The HOA never wanted residents to touch. He did not yet know the full truth, but he could feel the current beneath the surface. As the sun set, Silver Pine Bay turned a deep shade of orange. A light wind carried the scent of cold water. Daniel stood on the porch, rereading the violation notices one last time. He folded them carefully, not like a man surrendering, but like someone gathering evidence. Inside him, a clear thought took shape. If they believed he was weak, they would never see the counterstrike coming, and that underestimation would be their greatest mistake. The basement door swung open with a long creaking sound, and a thick cloud of dust poured out like a breath that had been held for decades. Daniel Brooks froze as the beam of his flashlight swept across an old metal trunk, sitting motionless as if it had been waiting to be awakened. Night had fallen deep. Outside, Silverpine Bay lay in complete darkness, broken only by the soft rhythm of water brushing the shore like a steady heartbeat. Inside the wooden house, Daniel moved slowly down the basement steps. The air smelled of rotting wood, rusted iron, and time itself. He was not searching for treasure. He was looking for answers. But some answers never appear unless someone is willing to dig deep enough. The trunk was not locked. Its lid opened with weight and resistance, as if it did not want to be disturbed. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, tied with frayed twine, old maps, handwritten ledgers, faded seals that still carried the shape of authority from a distant era. Daniel turned to each page, his expression changing little by little. Curiosity gave way to focus, and focus sharpened into something far more dangerous. The omniscient voice glides over the ancient text, the survey markings most people would ignore. But Daniel was not most people. He had lived by reading what others overlooked, by seeing what others missed. In his mind, the pieces began to align, slowly but with certainty. The boundary lines on the old maps did not match the boundaries the HOA had posted outside. Upstairs, the wall clock ticked steadily, indifferent. Daniel sat down on the basement floor, his back against a wooden shelf. He remembered Margaret Linton standing on the dock, declaring ownership with nothing but her voice. Back then, he had stayed silent. Not because he knew nothing, but because he did not need to speak yet. The next morning, Daniel laid the papers out on the dining table. Sunlight through the window revealed faded ink and deep creases from years of being unfolded and refolded. These were not ordinary documents. They were traces of a buried history. He began comparing them with the county's digital records he had downloaded the night before. The computer screen reflected in his eyes, its cold blue light harsh but honest. Outside, Margaret Linton sipped coffee on her balcony. She listened to birds, watched the water, and felt at ease. To her, Daniel was just a man surrounded by violation notices and social pressure. A chess piece about to be pushed off the board. She did not realize that within that sense of comfort, a mistake was quietly growing. Daniel noticed the first inconsistency when the survey markers did not align. The shoreline in the old documents extended farther, wider, and most importantly, made no mention of the HOA at all. A thought flashed through his mind, sending his heart racing. If these documents were real, then everything the HOA had claimed for years was nothing more than a layer of paint. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to celebrate, but to keep himself from moving too fast. He knew discoveries like this were dangerous. They did not just challenge a Karen, they challenged an entire system. And systems never collapse gently. That afternoon, Daniel drove into town. Inside the old records office, the smell of paper and ink was even stronger. The elderly archivist looked at him with curiosity when he asked for files few people ever requested. She flipped through ledgers, searched, then paused longer than usual. For a moment, Daniel saw hesitation cross her face. Then she nodded. Some things are preserved not because they are priceless, but because no one wants to confront them. When Daniel left the office, he carried an extra copy in his hands, his heart heavier but clearer. He was no longer just a man being harassed by an HOA. He was standing on a truth that, if brought into the light, could shake everything. HOA stories rarely reach this point. Karen stories usually end when the victim walks away. But this time was different. Night fell again. Daniel sat alone, the desk lamp illuminating maps spread wide before him. He knew he was being underestimated. He knew Margaret and those behind her did not see him as a real threat. And that was exactly what made him dangerous. He folded the documents carefully, like someone putting away a weapon. Outside, Silverpine Bay remained calm, but beneath the smooth surface, the current had changed direction, and Daniel Brooks was ready to follow it, until the truth was forced to rise to the surface. The gray pickup truck stopped abruptly in front of Daniel's porch as the afternoon light began to fade, its tires grinding against the gravel with a sharp screech that sounded like a warning. A man stepped out, trembling, his eyes constantly darting toward the main road as if he feared someone might be watching. His name was Ethan Miller. A neighbor. A face Daniel had only seen in passing. Always looking down. Always avoiding eye contact. Now, Ethan stood in front of him, hands clenched tight, palms slick with sweat. In that moment, Daniel understood that the silence of this neighborhood was not peace. It was fear. They sat in the small living room. Afternoon light streamed through the window, slicing Ethan's face into sharp contrasts of light and shadow. His voice broke as he began to speak. No hesitation. No concealment. He said Margaret Linton had paid him, not to harm Daniel directly, but to sign a statement. A fabricated statement. Ethan explained that Margaret wanted him to confirm Daniel was a danger to the community, that Daniel had threatened children kayaking, that he was a risk that needed to be removed. The document had already been prepared. Smooth wording, cold phrasing, written as if it were undeniable fact. In exchange was a sum of money large enough to make a desperate man waver. In the omniscient telling, the raw truth came into focus. Ethan was not a bad man. He was a man being crushed. His wife was seriously ill. Medical bills were piling up. The HOA fined him relentlessly over minor issues. Margaret knew all of it. Karens always know exactly where to squeeze until someone breaks. Daniel did not interrupt. He listened, his eyes free of judgment. A chill ran down his spine, not from fear, but from the terrifying precision of the plan. If Ethan signed, Daniel would be completely isolated. HOA stories had ended this way before. In courtrooms where victims no longer had a voice. Ethan placed the draft statement on the table. White paper, black ink, pure falsehood. He said he had not signed it, that he could not live with betraying someone who had done nothing wrong. But he also said Margaret would not stop, that this was only the beginning. Daniel nodded slowly. He felt the fear inside Ethan, but he also saw the small spark of courage, struggling not to go out. He placed his hand on the paper and folded it carefully. In his mind, a clear realization formed. Margaret did not just want him gone. She needed him erased from a much larger picture. When Ethan stood up to leave, the sky had already darkened. His figure blended into the road, small and alone. Daniel stood in the doorway, long after he was gone. In the glow of sunset, Silver Pine Bay looked brutally peaceful. A calm that concealed the dirty bargains made beneath it. Across the neighborhood, Margaret Linton was entertaining guests. In her spacious living room, she smiled and poured wine for a man in a dark suit, a representative of an eco-tourism company. They spoke of potential, of a waterfront resort, of private docks, luxury lodges, elegant cabins. Margaret said the community was ready, that only one small obstacle remained. The man asked about land usage rights. Margaret answered without hesitation. The HOA controlled everything. It was what she always said, and for far too long, no one had challenged it. Back in the wooden house, Daniel sat alone at the table. The fabricated statement lay beside the old maps. Two worlds collided in silence. One was buried truth. The other was a lie, fed and fattened by money. He realized the plot twist of his own life was taking shape. The man, seen as an outsider with no power, was holding something neither the HOA nor Karen ever expected. Daniel remembered Ethan's eyes, his trembling voice, and he understood this was no longer just his story. If he stepped back, the cycle would continue. People like Ethan would keep being crushed. Karen's stories would repeat. Only the names would change. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the lights across the neighborhood flicked on one by one, like eyes opening in the dark. Daniel was not afraid. Instead, he felt a strange calm. Now he knew exactly who he was facing. And more importantly, he knew he was standing on the truth. In the darkness, Silver Pine Bay quietly reflected the sky. No one could hear the movement beneath the surface, but the current had begun to spin faster. And from the moment Ethan knocked on his door, the game had entered a new phase. One where real power no longer belonged to the loudest voice, but to the one willing to hold on to the truth until the very end. The phone call came while the sky was still dim with early mist, the voice on the other end delivering a single short sentence before falling silent. The documents in his hands were not just trouble for the HOA. They could turn the entire bay upside down. Daniel Brooks stood motionless in the kitchen, his hand still holding the phone with its darkened screen. The cold of the early morning seeped through the window glass and into his chest. He had known this moment would come. He just had not expected it to arrive so quickly. When the truth begins to make noise, it no longer whispers. It knocks, hard, decisive. He drove away from Silver Pine Bay as the sun rose above the line of pine trees. The road toward town curved like a long, unanswered question. In his mind, the pieces lined up, waiting to be placed. Old maps, misaligned survey points, Ethan's confession, and now a meeting with people who understood the law at its deepest level. The law office was modest, without flashy signage. The woman who greeted him had dark hair and calm, piercing eyes. Her name was Laura Hayes, a specialist in land and shoreline rights. She listened without interrupting as Daniel laid the documents across her desk. When her fingers touched the yellowed pages, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel noticed. A quiet seriousness settled in the room. The omniscient voice follows every breath as Laura does not speak right away. She puts on her glasses and reads each line carefully, then looks up, her gaze direct and heavy. These documents are not meaningless copies, they are foundations. If fully verified, they show that shoreline rights never belonged to the HOA, not partially, but the entire stretch they have been advertising. Daniel felt his heart beat faster, yet his face remained composed. He was used to keeping emotion behind a calm exterior. Laura asked him a simple question, why he had not spoken sooner. Daniel replied that he needed certainty. Certainty so that when he did speak, no one could silence it. That afternoon, they met another person, a retired county records researcher. An old man with a bent back and a memory sharp as a blade. When he saw the maps, he let out a soft laugh, not from amusement, but bitterness. He said these boundaries had once been clearly recorded, before the neighborhood existed, and that some things had been deliberately blurred over time, because erasing is easier than confronting. Meanwhile, back in Silver Pine Bay, Margaret Linton moved quickly through the community center, making call after call, her voice tighter than usual. The investors wanted final confirmation. They needed assurance there were no disputes. Margaret reassured them, saying everything was under control, but inside her, an uneasy feeling was rising. She could not explain it, only that Daniel's silence had gone on for too long. Daniel returned home after dark. He sat alone, spreading everything across the table. Internal HOA emails, forwarded by Ethan. Unpublicized meeting minutes. Money routed through a shell company under the harmless label of consulting fees. Everything aligned into a disturbing straight line. No longer suspicion. Structure. System. He recognized the plot twist of his own story. Daniel Brooks, the man seen as an outsider with no power, was standing in a position where he could press pause on a project worth millions. No threats needed. No shouting required. Just the truth placed where it belonged. He thought of Ethan, of the elderly neighbor, of those who had left in silence. A decision formed inside him, slow but irreversible. If he only protected himself, the story would repeat. Another Karen, another HOA. But if he went all the way, the current would change direction. Night fell. Daniel stood on the porch as wind from the bay swept in, cold but clean. He felt the weight of what he was carrying. Not power to control others, but power to end a cycle. In the darkness, lights from the neighborhood trembled across the water, like lies beginning to lose their balance. Daniel went back inside and gathered the documents. No rush. No shaking hands. He knew he was entering the most dangerous phase, the moment just before the truth is spoken, when those who profit from darkness react the hardest. But he also knew that once the light is turned on, no one can pretend not to see it. In Silver Pine Bay, everything still looked peaceful. But beneath that calm, a wave was rising, and Daniel Brooks, the man most underestimated of all, was standing at the very center of it. The doors to the community hall swung open before the meeting had officially begun, and the low murmurs inside were instantly strangled into silence. Daniel Brooks stepped in slowly, while at the front, Margaret Linton was already standing at the podium, her confident smile firmly in place. The room was flooded with bright light. Rows of chairs were packed tight, residents of Silver Pine Bay sitting shoulder to shoulder, carrying a mix of emotions: curiosity, anxiety, anticipation. This was a mandatory meeting, summoned urgently with promises of a prosperous future, a major project, a life-changing opportunity. Margaret had used her familiar voice to inflate that hope. She began her speech with the smooth confidence of someone long accustomed to standing above others. She spoke of security, of property values, of a long-term vision for the community. Every word was polished, exciting enough to stir desire, vague enough to reveal nothing concrete. When the screen behind her lit up, glossy renderings appeared. A waterfront resort, private docks, winding stone paths. The murmurs returned, this time charged with excitement. Margaret paused at exactly the right moment. She lowered her voice, solemn. She said that to achieve this future, the community had to stand united, had to remove disruptive elements. Her eyes swept across the room and stopped briefly on Daniel, just for a second. But it was enough. A Karen knows how to point without naming. Daniel stood up. Just one small movement, yet the room fell completely silent again. He stepped into the aisle, feeling dozens of eyes lock onto him. In those looks were doubt, disdain, pity. To many, he was still just the quiet man in the wooden house by the bay, the one who never attended HOA gatherings. He did not rush to speak. He placed a stack of papers on the table in front of the podium. The sound of paper hitting wood was dry and sharp. Then he looked directly at Margaret. In that moment, her smile faltered, just slightly, but not enough to escape the notice of someone who had been waiting for this instant. Daniel began in a calm voice. He introduced himself, without flair, without complaint. Then he spoke about the violation notices, the warning signs, the attempts to silence him with paperwork. Each sentence was short and clear. No personal attacks, only facts. The room began to stir in a different way. No longer excitement, but doubt. Margaret interrupted him. She said this was not a forum for accusations, that the HOA held full authority, that everything was legal. Her voice grew higher, faster. Karen was losing control. Daniel nodded. Then he turned the stack of papers toward the residents. Old maps, county records, internal emails. He did not over-explain. He only pointed out the inconsistencies, the boundaries, the usage rights, the sums of money hidden behind harmless names. The representative from the ecotourism company, seated in the front row, leaned forward to look more closely. His expression shifted from confidence to tension. He turned to Margaret and asked a short question. She answered too quickly. Her words began to stumble. The omniscient voice moves through the thoughts of everyone in the room. Some residents realized they had never been consulted. Others remembered fines that had never made sense. Ethan Miller lowered his head, heart pounding. The elderly neighbor clenched her hands. Margaret Linton felt the room slipping from her grasp, inch by inch. Daniel ended with a simple statement, that before anyone voted on the future, they deserved to know the truth about the present. He did not threaten. He did not beg. He simply placed the truth on the table, where everyone could see it. The air grew heavy. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a brief moment, Karen had nothing left to stand on. Her power, built on ambiguity and fear, was cracking. Daniel stepped back and returned to his seat. He did not look at anyone. He was finished. The climax was not in shouting, but in the long silence that followed, a silence where each person was forced to face their own questions. Outside, wind from the bay rattled the windows. Inside that brightly lit room, everything had changed. Not because one man stood up, but because the truth had entered, and no one could pretend they had not seen it. The sound of a police siren cut through the air outside the community hall just as Margaret Linton tried to speak again. It was not loud, but it was enough to choke every defense in her throat. The glass doors slid open, and 2 officers stepped inside, their boots striking the floor in steady, emotionless rhythm. No one had signaled for them. They did not need to be. Their presence felt like a conclusion already written. The crowded room suddenly felt smaller, breaths tightening, every gaze locking onto the podium where Margaret stood frozen. One officer read her name clearly, without emotion. Margaret turned, forcing a tight smile, trying to keep her voice steady. She said this was a misunderstanding, that she was the HOA president, that everything was backed by paperwork. But this time, the paperwork no longer stood with her. Daniel Brooks remained seated. He did not stand. He did not look over. In that moment, his real power revealed itself in the quietest way possible. He did not need to say another word. He had placed the truth where it belonged, and now the system was moving on its own. The second officer stepped forward and issued an arrest order on suspicion of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of authority. The words dropped into the room like heavy stones. Margaret's mouth fell open. A Karen, who had always controlled the room with her voice, could no longer even control her own breathing. Metal clicked as the handcuffs closed. Short, dry, final. In that instant, the woman who had once stood above everyone, who had given orders, who had ruled HOA stories, collapsed into a small, panicked figure. Some residents turned their faces away. Others stared without blinking, as if trying to carve the moment into memory forever. Ethan Miller stood up, his hands trembling slightly. He felt lighter, as if an invisible rope had just been loosened from around his neck. The elderly neighbor exhaled, tears streaming down her face in silence. Those who had once stayed quiet began whispering to each other, no longer afraid, but realizing they had lived under a shadow for far too long. The representative from the ecotourism company jumped to his feet, his face draining of color. He muttered about contracts, about investments, about not being informed. No one listened anymore. The project, once painted as paradise, collapsed instantly, revealing a cold chain of manipulation beneath it. Margaret was led outside. As she passed Daniel, she stopped for the span of a heartbeat. Her eyes no longer held contempt or threats. They held late realization that the man she had dismissed was the one who had brought everything down. Daniel looked up at her one last time. No satisfaction, no anger, just calm, like watching a storm finally pass. The room slowly emptied. Voices faded. People left, carrying an unfamiliar feeling. Their familiar world had just changed. No Karen at the center. No HOA looming over every small decision. But that freedom came with uncertainty. What would happen next? Daniel stayed behind. He gathered his papers slowly. There was no sense of victory in the usual way. Only deep exhaustion and a quiet relief he could not quite name. He knew the battle was not completely over. Consequences would linger. But the point of no return had been crossed. Outside, night had fully fallen. Silver Pine Bay lay silent, lights trembling across the surface of the water. Daniel stepped out and took a long breath. The air was cold, but clean. He thought of those who had left before him, never given the chance to stand up. He thought of the Karen stories that would no longer be written here, at least not for a very long time. In the omniscient telling, a cycle had just been broken. Not by brute force, not by shouting, but by patience, by holding on to the truth until the end. Daniel Brooks, the man most underestimated of all, had become the anchor for a community he never tried to control. As he left the parking lot, The steady sound of waves followed behind him. Life would continue. Not perfect, but different. And within that difference, there was a small spark of hope, enough for those who once bowed their heads to begin standing straight again. The morning after the storm arrived in silence, so quiet it was almost unsettling. There were no new violation signs, no security vehicles parked along the bay, no floods of commanding emails. Silver Pine Bay woke up as if it had been given its breath back. Daniel Brooks stood on the porch of his wooden house, watching the still water reflect the pale gray sky. News spread faster than he expected. Margaret Linton was suspended the same day, then formally charged not long after. The HOA board collapsed like a hollow structure with its core pulled out. People who had once stayed silent began talking to each other, cautiously at first, then more openly. A community once ruled by fear was learning how to speak in its own voice. But the final plot twist was not Karen's downfall. It was Daniel's choice. One afternoon, he invited the residents to the old community room. No podium, no microphone, just folding chairs, arranged in a circle. He stood in the center, no higher than anyone else, no lower either. He said that legally, he had the right to demand compensation, the right to restrict access to the bay, the right to turn the place into a highly profitable asset. Many people held their breath, waiting for a power shift, expecting someone else to rise and replace Karen. Daniel paused for a long moment before continuing. In that silence, the omniscient voice brushed against every thought in the room. Fear, hope, doubt. Daniel said he had not come here to rule anyone. He had come to live in peace. And peace could not exist if it was built on someone else's fear. He proposed a different solution: the complete dissolution of the mandatory HOA, the creation of a voluntary, transparent residents association with no power to fine, no power to coerce. The bay would be preserved. No resort, no private docks, no projects designed to enrich a small group. A few people began to cry. Not because they had won, but because for the first time, they were being treated as people with the right to choose. Ethan Miller stood up, his voice trembling but clear. He said he was willing to join the Residents Association. The elderly neighbor nodded repeatedly, tears falling into her hands. Those who had once avoided Daniel's eyes now looked at him with respect, mixed with gratitude. There was no loud applause, only a quiet agreement spreading through the room. Time passed. Silver Pine Bay changed slowly, but honestly. Small gatherings began to appear. People brought food to share. Children returned to the shoreline, laughing without fear of being yelled at. Stories about HOA stories and Karen stories became memories spoken with disbelief, as if it were hard to imagine they had once lived that way. Daniel returned to his own rhythm of life. Kayaking every morning. Reading in the evenings. Occasionally, someone stopped to talk. Not to ask permission, but simply to say hello. He did not become the new leader. He became part of the community, exactly as he had hoped from the beginning. Elsewhere, Margaret Linton faced the consequences of her choices. Her story was told as a lesson, not for mockery, but as a reminder. Power without oversight will always find a way to abuse itself. Karens are not born in a single day. They are nurtured by the prolonged silence of those around them. On the final summer sunset, Daniel stood alone by the bay. Orange light stretched across the water. He thought about the road behind him, about being underestimated, about how real power does not lie in controlling others, but in choosing not to, even when you can. The narration slows and settles. Silver Pine Bay did not become paradise, but it became more honest. And sometimes, that is enough. If you are listening to this story, ask yourself one question. If you were Daniel, would you choose control or release? If you have ever lived under an abusive HOA or encountered a Karen in real life, share your story in the comments. A like helps this story reach more people. And if you want to hear more HOA Karen stories and Reddit stories where the underestimated stand up and break the cycle of power, subscribe. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to bow for an entire community to remember how to stand tall again.